Okay, wow. This deep dive, you guys have really sent us down a rabbit hole with this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're tackling excerpts from Hitler's Wikipedia entry
Great.
and focusing mainly on his early life and kind of his entry into politics. But, the real twist here is we're not just going to be, reciting facts and dates and that kind of thing. We're
Sure.
really trying to understand,
Yeah.
unravel the
It's
mystery
a mystery.
of how this guy, this seemingly ordinary man, became one of history's most infamous dictators.
Oh, absolutely. It's a question that's haunted historians for decades.
Right.
And I think these snippets, they offer some really intriguing clues, even though they're from just one source.
Yeah, because it's so easy to just label Hitler as evil, and just move on.
Right.
But to really understand how the Nazi regime came to be, we need to dig deeper, right?
We do.
So, starting with his roots,
Okay.
his father, Alois, was illegitimate, and the family name was originally Schicklgruber. It was later changed to Hitler.
That's a detail that on the surface might seem trivial.
Right.
But I think it speaks to a potential undercurrent of shame,
Yeah.
or maybe even like a desire to reinvent himself.
Oh,
Do you think that they could have influenced Hitler's later obsession with racial purity
Yeah.
and creating this master race?
That's a fascinating connection. And then there's his birthplace,
Yeah.
Austria, right near the German border.
Right on the edge there.
How significant was that in shaping his worldview?
Well, I think hugely significant. You see, Austria at the time was kind of this melting pot
Yeah.
of cultures and ethnicities.
Right.
It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Uh-huh.
But Hitler gravitated toward a strong German identity,
Oh.
rejecting this multiculturalism that surrounded him.
So the seeds of his nationalism were sown early on.
Yeah.
What about his childhood?
Yeah.
Well, Wikipedia describes it as difficult.
Right.
But, I mean, that seems like kind of an understatement when you really...
I think so. It was tumultuous for sure,
Yeah.
marked by these conflicts with his very authoritarian father, physical abuse, and the death of his younger brother, Edmund.
Wow.
And while we can't, draw a direct line from these experiences to his later atrocities,
Sure.
trauma often leaves a mark.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how these early wounds might have warped his perception of the world,
Yeah.
his need for control, his tendency towards violence.
Precisely. And, these tendencies might have even been further exacerbated by his move to Vienna,
Okay.
where he was trying to become an artist.
Wait, Hitler an artist?
Yep.
I mean, that's not really an image that comes to mind.
I know, right? It seems so incongruous
Yeah.
with the brutality that he later unleashed. But he was a passionate admirer of Wagner's operas,
Okay.
deeply moved by these grand narratives and the emotional intensity.
Huh. Almost a foreshadowing of his own grandiose
Right.
and ultimately destructive ambitions.
Perhaps, but, Vienna also exposed him to the darker undercurrents of society.
Right.
The city was a breeding ground for these racist and anti-Semitic ideologies, which were often presented as this legitimate political discourse.
So this wasn't fringe ideas.
No, not at all.
This was like mainstream.
It was mainstream thought.
Wow.
And, historians debate exactly when Hitler's anti-Semitism solidified.
Yeah.
But Vienna definitely offered this fertile ground for those seeds of hatred to really take root and grow.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's World War I. I mean, this cataclysmic event that shaped an entire generation.
Absolutely.
Hitler actually volunteered for the German army.
He did.
Despite being Austrian.
Despite being Austrian.
I mean, that really says something.
That really speaks volumes about his fervent German nationalism.
Yeah.
And he served as a dispatch runner,
Okay.
not in direct combat.
Okay.
Yet he received Iron Crosses for bravery.
I'm curious, how common was that for non-combat roles?
That's a point of contention among historians.
Oh, really?
Some suggest it points to genuine acts of courage, while others, they see it as a sign of his ambition and a desire for recognition.
Interesting.
But regardless of that, Germany's defeat in the war had a profound impact on him.
Oh, absolutely. He fully embraced the stab in the back myth,
He did.
blaming Jews and these other internal enemies for the loss.
Right, a myth that ignored the complex realities of the war and laid the blame at the feet of scapegoats.
Yeah.
And this narrative was further fueled by the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, yeah. The treaty that so many Germans saw as a humiliating imposition instead of fostering peace, it just sowed these seeds of resentment and anger.
And it's precisely this resentment that Hitler would later exploit
Wow.
so effectively.
Yeah.
He channeled the anger and humiliation of an entire nation into this powerful political movement.
So the war ends, Hitler returns to Munich deeply disillusioned, but also energized by this newfound sense of purpose.
Yeah.
What happens next in this journey towards becoming a dictator?
Well, he takes a very decisive step that will change the course of history.
Okay.
He becomes an informant for the German army,
What?
infiltrating a small fringe political party, the German Workers' Party. And even at this early stage, his writings, things like the Gemlich letter, openly called for the removal of Jews.
It's startling to see how fully formed his extremist views were even then.
Yeah, and these views intensify as the German Workers' Party transforms into the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
The NSDAP or the Nazis.
Or the Nazis, yeah.
And it's during this period we see the emergence of those infamous symbols.
Yes.
The swastika,
Yes.
the raised arms salute,
Right.
symbols that would soon become synonymous with just terror and oppression.
You know, symbols, however, are only as powerful as the meaning we imbue them with.
Sure.
And Hitler, with his uncanny ability to manipulate crowds and tap into the darkest recesses of human nature, he knew how to weaponize them.
Wow.
His speeches, filled with his fiery rhetoric and these promises of national revival, they drew in those who felt disenfranchised and disillusioned by this post-war reality.
It's almost like he offered a twisted form of hope.
Yeah.
A way to make sense of the chaos and the suffering.
Absolutely. And his failed coup attempt, the beer hall putsch,
Right.
that only served to enhance his mystique.
Right, because it transformed him into this martyr
Exactly.
in the eyes of his followers.
Yes. And while imprisoned for the push, he penned Mein Kampf.
Okay.
This rambling but chilling manifesto that really laid bare his ideology,
Yeah.
including his vision of a world without Jews.
Mein Kampf is often cited as a warning sign that the world ignored.
It is.
But his rise to power was aided by forces far greater than himself.
Oh, absolutely.
The Great Depression created this global economic crisis that shook Germany to its core.
It did. Millions were unemployed.
Right.
They were struggling to survive,
Yeah.
desperately seeking solutions.
And Hitler, with his promises of national renewal and scapegoating of minorities, offered a very seductive,
He did.
albeit dangerous, answer to their plight.
Yeah, he targeted farmers, veterans, the middle class, all those who felt betrayed by the existing system. And his message resonated deeply, exploiting these economic anxieties to fuel his political ascent.
He even managed to become a German citizen after a period of statelessness,
He did.
paving the way for his eventual run for president against Hindenburg,
Right.
a race he lost,
Yeah.
but which further solidified his position as a major political force.
Yeah.
And then, in a stroke of luck, or perhaps something a bit more sinister,
Right.
the Reichstag fire occurred.
Yes. A pivotal event that Hitler very skillfully exploited
Oh.
to seize more power, blaming the fire on communists and using that ensuing fear and chaos to justify these emergency decrees.
Wasn't there also something called the Enabling Act?
Ah, yes. The Enabling Act was a masterstroke of political maneuvering.
Right.
A legal sleight of hand that effectively granted Hitler dictatorial powers.
Really?
It allowed his cabinet to enact laws without the approval of the Reichstag, effectively dismantling the democratic system from within.
It's chilling how he managed to subvert the very system that he claimed to be saving.
A sobering reminder that even the most robust democracies are vulnerable to those who seek to exploit them for their own ends.
So by 1933, the Weimar Republic lay in ruins, and Hitler, the once fringe politician, stood triumphant as the absolute ruler of Germany.
Yes, a triumph built on a foundation of hatred, manipulation, and a tragically misplaced hope. But the story doesn't end there.
Right.
Hitler's rise to power was merely the prelude to a far darker chapter, the consolidation of his dictatorship and the unleashing of his horrific vision upon the world.
Well, on that note, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back to dig into that darker chapter right after this.
Sounds good.
It's almost unfathomable how from these, chaotic beginnings, Hitler managed to establish such a firm grip on power. What were his first moves once the Weimar Republic was essentially, dismantled?
Swift and brutal.
Yeah.
Any remaining opposition was ruthlessly crushed.
So it wasn't just about gaining power. It was about eliminating any possibility of dissent.
Exactly. control over information, and the narrative became, paramount.
Right.
Trade unions, seen as potential hotbeds of resistance, were dissolved
Oh.
and replaced with this Nazi-controlled German labor front.
Creating a facade of unity while stripping workers of their rights and power.
Precisely. And to further solidify his control over, well, really the instruments of power, Hitler orchestrated a chilling event, the Night of the Long Knives.
Wasn't that the purge of the SA leadership?
It was.
But I thought the SA was a key part of the Nazi movement. Why turn on his own supporters?
It was a ruthless but calculated move.
Hmm.
The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had grown too powerful, too independent for Hitler's liking. They posed a threat to his authority, especially within the army, whose support he needed to really consolidate his power.
So it was a preemptive strike.
Yeah, to eliminate any potential rivals.
Right.
And to send a very clear message. Absolute loyalty was demanded, and any challenge to his authority would be met with swift and brutal retribution.
It's disturbing how quickly and easily he resorted to violence to maintain his grip on power. And this was all before the war even began.
It is a haunting reminder that the seeds of genocide are often sown in these seemingly small acts of cruelty and intolerance.
Right.
Which, if left unchecked, can escalate with terrifying speed.
And then the death of President Hindenburg in 1934, that removed the last vestiges of any constitutional constraint on Hitler's power.
Yes, with Hindenburg gone, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, creating this new title of Führer and Reichskanzler.
Wow.
He was now the absolute dictator of Germany.
And with this newfound authority, his true agenda, the one hinted at in Mein Kampf, began to take shape. His obsession with Lebensraum.
Living space.
Yeah, living space for the German people. That became the driving force behind his foreign policy.
He envisioned an expansion eastward, conquering these vast territories to create a German empire stretching across Eastern Europe.
It's just his twisted vision of national destiny fueled by this toxic blend of nationalism, racism, and this really distorted view of history. Absolutely. And all of this was happening while the rest of the world stood by, seemingly paralyzed by indecision or this misplaced belief that appeasement would satisfy Hitler's ambitions.
Remember, this was a time when memories of the horrors of World War I were still fresh.
Right.
Many in Europe were desperate to avoid another conflict, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the growing danger.
But Hitler was already violating Treaty of Versailles at this point. He started rearming Germany, rebuilding the military in direct defiance of the treaty's restrictions.
He was, and he did so with this calculated boldness, testing the resolve of the other European powers. He formed alliances with Mussolini's Italy and Imperial Japan, creating the Axis powers.
Right.
A bloc united by these expansionist ambitions and a shared disdain for the existing world order.
It's fascinating and terrifying to see how he was able to manipulate the international political landscape to his advantage. He annexed Austria in 1938.
He did.
Claiming it was simply a reunification of German-speaking peoples.
Right.
A move met with little more than diplomatic protests.
Yeah. Exactly. And emboldened by this lack of meaningful opposition, he turned his attention to the Sudetenland.
Right.
A region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German population.
Okay.
Using the pretext of protecting these ethnic Germans, Hitler manufactured a crisis, demanding the Sudetenland be ceded to Germany.
Which led to the infamous Munich Agreement.
It did.
The British and French prime ministers, Chamberlain and Daladier, eager to avoid war at almost any cost, agreed to Hitler's demands, believing they had achieved peace for our time.
A tragic miscalculation, as we now know. Hitler saw their willingness to appease him as a sign of weakness.
Right.
Further emboldening his aggression.
So even when he got what he wanted, it wasn't enough. He was already setting the stage for a larger conflict.
Precisely. He was playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship, pushing the limits of what he could get away with, testing the resolve of his opponents.
And then, in September 1939, his gamble paid off. He invaded Poland, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France, plunging Europe into the abyss of World War II.
A war that Hitler had carefully planned for. A war that would unleash unimaginable horrors upon the world.
But he wasn't going into this war alone.
No.
He had already secured a secret pact with Stalin, the Soviet dictator.
Ah, yes, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right.
A cynical agreement between two totalitarian regimes.
Right.
Each seeking to exploit the other for their own gain. They agreed to divide Poland between them, a betrayal that shocked the world.
It's a stark reminder that alliances in the realm of international politics are often based on convenience and self-interest rather than any shared values or principles.
A lesson that resonates even today as we navigate a world where alliances shift and crumble with alarming frequency.
So the war begins, and initially Hitler seems unstoppable.
He does.
His blitzkrieg tactics, combining these lightning-fast armored assaults with overwhelming air power, they just swept through Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in a matter of months.
Yeah, the speed and brutality of these early victories stunned the world and seemed to validate Hitler's claims of German military superiority. His popularity at home soared, fueled by propaganda that portrayed him as this masterful strategist, a visionary leader destined to restore Germany to its former glory.
But these victories were short-lived. His decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, proved to be a fatal miscalculation.
Indeed, the vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the harshness of the Russian winter, they all conspired to bog down the German army in a protracted and costly campaign, ultimately draining their resources and weakening their resolve.
He was a turning point in the war, a turning point that exposed the flaws in Hitler's strategic thinking and the limits of his military prowess.
And as the war dragged on, his grip on reality seemed to loosen. His decision-making became, well, increasingly erratic, fueled by paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and a growing addiction to amphetamines.
And yet, even as the tide turned against him, even as the Allied forces closed in from the west and the Soviets pushed relentlessly from the east, he refused to concede defeat.
He did.
Clinging to this fantasy of a final, miraculous victory.
His fanaticism, the very quality that had propelled his rise to power, now became his undoing, blinding him to the reality of his situation and leading him to make decisions that would ultimately seal his fate and the fate of millions.
And it was during these final years of the war that the full horror of his ideology, the systematic extermination of Jews and other groups deemed undesirable, reached its terrifying climax.
The Holocaust, a genocide of unimaginable scale, was already well underway by the time the war began.
It's hard to believe that something so monstrous could happen, that a nation could descend into such barbarity.
The human capacity for evil is a dark and complex truth that we must confront, even as it challenges our faith in humanity.
And while there may be no single document, no smoking gun order directly from Hitler that explicitly details the final solution, his speeches, his directives, the minutes from the Wannsee Conference where the logistics of the genocide were planned, all point to his central role in this horrific chapter of history.
His words, his actions, his silences all bear witness to his culpability.
It's a sobering reminder that we can't simply dismiss Hitler as an aberration, a monster who sprung fully formed from the depths of history.
He was, after all, a product of his time.
Right.
A time when anti-Semitism was widespread, when ideas of racial purity and national superiority were not considered fringe beliefs, but were often espoused by intellectuals, politicians, and even scientists.
Which makes it all the more important to understand the historical context, to see how the seeds of hate can take root and flourish in seemingly fertile ground.
And to recognize that the battle against intolerance and bigotry is not a battle that was won or lost in the past.
Right.
It's a battle that continues to this day. A battle that demands our constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity.
It's a lot to process. You know, on one hand, it feels like the world was just sleepwalking into this catastrophe.
Yeah.
But on the other, you mentioned Hitler was a product of his time.
Right.
How could so many people be swayed by such extreme ideologies?
Oh, it's a question that historians continue to grapple with.
Yeah.
You know, it's easy to judge the past through the lens of our present-day knowledge.
Right.
But we have to remember that, you know, the world between the wars was a very different place.
Right. The scars of World War I ran deeply. People were disillusioned. Economies were shattered. I mean...
Exactly. And that created fertile ground for these extremist movements to take root.
Yeah.
Democracy itself was still a relatively new concept in many parts of Europe, and a lot of people were yearning for strong leadership, someone to restore order and national pride.
So in a way, Hitler was offering a perverse kind of hope, a way to make sense of the chaos and the uncertainty.
And he did so with masterful propaganda. He controlled the media. He staged these elaborate rallies. He used radio broadcasts to spread his message far and wide.
Okay.
He understood the power of symbols, of spectacle, of appealing to people's emotions rather than their reason.
He was a master manipulator, tapping into these deep-seated fears and prejudices, scapegoating minorities, promising a return to this mythical past of greatness.
And let's not forget the role of fear.
Oh, yeah.
As Hitler consolidated his power,
Yeah.
anyone who dared to speak out was silenced, imprisoned, or worse.
Yeah.
The Gestapo, his secret police force,
Right.
created this atmosphere of terror and suspicion.
So even if people had doubts, they were too afraid to voice them.
Exactly. It's a chilling reminder of how easily fear can be used to control a population, to stifle dissent, to create a climate of conformity.
And what about the international community? Why didn't other countries do more to stop him sooner?
Well, there were a number of factors at play. As we discussed earlier, memories of World War I were still vivid.
Right.
There was a strong aversion to another conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Appeasement, however misguided, was seen by many as the best way to avoid war.
They were hoping to contain Hitler's ambitions by giving him concessions,
Right.
but it only emboldened him.
And there are also internal divisions within countries like Britain and France.
Oh, okay.
Some saw Hitler as a bulwark against the spread of communism,
Oh, wow.
which they feared even more than fascism.
It's hard to believe that such short-sightedness could have prevailed, but I guess that's the danger of hindsight.
Yeah, we tend to view the past through the lens of our present-day knowledge.
Right.
But the people making decisions at the time were operating with incomplete information
Sure.
and under immense pressure.
It's a sobering lesson about the complexities of history, the dangers of underestimating these extremist ideologies, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
And it highlights the crucial importance of critical thinking,
Yeah.
of being able to discern fact from fiction,
Huh?
propaganda from truth.
Especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides,
Right.
we need to be able to evaluate sources, to question narratives, to think for ourselves.
Couldn't agree more. We can't afford to be passive consumers of information.
Right.
We need to be active, engaged citizens willing to challenge those in power
Yeah.
and to hold them accountable.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah.
We've explored Hitler's life, his rise to power, the horrors he unleashed upon the world. I mean, it's a heavy story,
It is.
one that's difficult to grapple with.
But it's a story that we can't afford to ignore.
Right.
By understanding the past, we can better equip ourselves to face the challenges of the present and to prevent the mistakes of history from being repeated.
And as we try to make sense of the world today with its own share of conflicts and divisions, what lessons can we take away from this deep dive into the life and legacy of Adolf Hitler?
The most important lesson, I think, is that we can't afford to be complacent.
Oh.
The seeds of hatred and intolerance are still out there waiting for the right conditions to take root and grow.
Right.
It's up to each of us to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to defend the values of human dignity and equality.
It's a call to action, a reminder that history is not something that just happened to us.
Right.
It's something that we create
We do.
through our choices, our actions, our inactions.
That's right.
And ultimately, it's up to us to shape a future where the horrors of the past are never repeated.
Well said. And to you listening, I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically about the world around you,
Yeah.
to question assumptions, and to never take your freedoms for granted.
We all have a role to play in building a more just and compassionate world.
We do.
Let's learn from the mistakes of the past and work together to create a better future.
Indeed, because as the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.